How many times have you thought to yourself, I have a great idea? Additionally, how many times has that great idea turned out to be not so great? While you might have a definitive answer to that question, I lost count a long time ago. And one might think that in my old age of 33 years, I finally wised up and stopped making the same decisions. But what you'll see over the course of this video is my attempt to turn what I thought would be a cool project into basically salvaging this ash slab that I paid $270 for. So at this point with the slab, my vision was to create 2 live edge coffee tables, maybe with a metal base, but obviously the slab portion being the top of each. Now because these slab pieces were so wide, they wouldn't fit through my planer, meaning that I had to use my router sled to flatten each side. It doesn't really matter what they look like as long as they're flat on one side, and surprisingly this works pretty well. Once the slab has been completely flattened on both sides, the belt sander will come in, take all those lines out, and get this slab cleaned up. But we'll shortly find another problem, which is typical with any live edge slab pieces. There's oftentimes cracks, holes, and gaps that'll need to be cleaned up first before we can put any type of epoxy or sealant in these holes. Otherwise that nasty bark will be at risk of deterioration over time. This particular crack went all the way through the slab, meaning that, well, we'll have to seal it up. Now, if you're someone that enjoys gambling, then now would be a good time to place your bet as whether this tuck tape and duct tape will be strong enough to hold all the epoxy that we're going to put in this hole. Now, before you think, come on man, you should know better than doing this, now would be a good time to say that this footage is actually about a year and a half old, and this is the very first time that I had ever used epoxy. If you placed your wagers that the epoxy would leak through, you can collect your reward now. And if I'm not clear enough on what happened, the epoxy that should be in that hole is now down on the floor. If you've never had the pleasure of cleaning up spilled epoxy, well, it's not exactly something I'd recommend to do for fun. Fortunately, the very bottom of that hole had filled up solid, so I was able to just pour more epoxy in and let it finally harden up a couple days later. Potentially even more frustrating than cleaning up that spill was trying to get this mess of tape off the bottom, which had basically adhered to and became one with the epoxy. And at this point, honestly, I was pretty frustrated with how this had gone, so I did what I do with most of my projects when they don't go well, which is to put them in the corner out of the way for about a year, which brings us to present time, which is what we're seeing now. Now technically there's not exactly a reason as to why I finally decided not to make these into a coffee table. I think overall I was just frustrated with how the project had gone. But eventually I had a friend reach out to me for a custom request build, and it just so happened that I had just the right amount of ash to use for whatever the pieces were that they wanted. So in an attempt to reclaim my $270 loss, I got to work. So despite the fact that for this project, I might be paying myself $0 an hour, the cool thing about woodworking is that there is no blueprint. If something goes wrong, or you mess something up, you can either fix it or redesign the entire project to make it into something else. So from the next steps as what you can see me doing, it's pretty obvious that it would be much easier to just do this with regular boards. But the cool thing about using slab pieces is that oftentimes you can find some really unique grain across the top of the pieces. And since this is ash, it also has a bunch of tiny holes where beetles and bugs have gotten into the tree before it was cut down. Now by normal lumber standards, these are all characteristics that you don't want with typical milled boards. However, each aspect of these characteristics will make these pieces a bit more unique, and that top grain is going to look awesome at the very end, which we'll see when we put finish on a little later in the video. For now, however, we'll focus on turning this square block of wood into a circular shape. While the process of cutting a circle out looks a little complicated, it's actually really simple. All you really need to do is attach your router to a base that expands across the diameter of the circle you want to cut, create a pivot point in the center, and then plunge the router bit deeper with each pass. It's perfectly fine to cut all the way through with the router, but if your bit won't plunge deep enough, you can always use a bandsaw or a jigsaw to cut out the remaining piece, and then a flesh trim bit to come back and cut off that very bottom section. It'll be extremely obvious in just a minute what I'm building with these pieces. Before we get to that, I wanted to detail the edges of each circle using a roundover bit on the top and a big chamfer bit on the bottom. The same is true with each of the triangular pieces, which will be the legs for these set of end tables that I'm making. Normally when attaching legs to any table base, you'll almost always have an apron which will allow you to use Z-clips or figure 8 fasteners or something like that. But the way that this table is going to set, that's not possible. So instead of those methods, we'll use hanger bolts. The problem with using hanger bolts is that hole in the top of the leg needs to be perfectly vertical. If it's off whatsoever, then the legs won't line up. Now the easiest way to do this would be use a doweling jig. But I couldn't find my doweling jig at the time of this video, so I made my own. And as long as you have a drill press, you could do the exact same thing. In fact, this is also a really easy way to make any type of guide that you need to drill a perfectly vertical hole for. The second problem with using hanger bolts is that there's not a head on the bolt to help thread the bolt down into the hole. And the solution to this issue is to put 2 lock nuts on the top, which will lock against each other and then allow you to drive that bolt right down into the leg. So the hanger bolts are installed, but at this point, technically, they're useless. And that's because the threads of the hanger bolts don't have anything to go down into. But to fix this problem, we'll put some threaded inserts up on the underside of the tabletop. That way the legs can actually be attached to the table. So we're using 3 legs on these end tables, which has both a benefit and a detriment. The benefit being that since it only has 3 legs, it'll always set flat. Unlike a table with 4 legs, it's impossible for these tables to rock back and forth, so it doesn't matter if they're actually level. The detriment, which is actually a very small issue, is that the legs need to be equally spaced, or it might look slightly skewed or offset. But fortunately, that's an easy fix just by drawing another circle with a smaller diameter on the underside and measuring equal spacing between the inserts. Now because these are end tables, most likely they'll just be holding up a lamp, maybe a wallet and some keys, but I wanted to make sure that they were sturdy enough for that lamp, so I tested them out with my full body weight, and unless somebody's able to find a lamp that weighs over 200 pounds, I'm pretty confident that these will be strong enough. Now if it was up to me, I would have left these tables the natural color of the ash, but my friend that requested this set of end tables wanted them to be gray, so I made them gray. Now rather than flood them with just a regular oil-based gray stain, I used Rubio Monaco gray to really highlight the grain, but also leave a little bit of the natural color of that ash. And in the end, I think this color turned out as a happy medium that would satisfy both any woodworker that enjoys the natural color of the wood, but also the recipient of this table who wanted them to be gray. So sometimes those wild ideas work, and other times they don't. But one thing that I learned is that every piece you build doesn't have to be overly extravagant. It's always possible to pivot the design. Sometimes simple crisp and clean is just right. Thanks for watching.